Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter.
Investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff.
Second try.
Yeah, our second take went better. This is going to be our last podcast of 2020. We're recording this on Monday, December 28th. And so we're going to use this week's podcast as kind of a wrap up of 2020. And we're each going to talk a little bit about what we thought were the biggest stories that we worked on this year. And I think before we do that, I mean, the obvious point to make is that the COVID-19 pandemic sort of dominated, everything this year. And I don't think there was a major story this year that was not colored in some way by the pandemic. I mean, even if we're talking about economic issues, election issues, certainly public health, even I think if we talk about the Black Lives Matter protests that happened in the late spring and early summer in San Antonio and other cities, even they were affected to some degree by the pandemic. You had people wearing masks and having to take the public health risks into account. And so it factored into everything. So anyway, I'm going to start with you, Josh, and just talk a little bit about what stood out to you as far as the stuff that you were covering this year.
I was really hoping you would have Brian go first. No,
we can do that.
No. Like my big thing that I watched this year, and I feel like I devoted a lot of time to, was just watching simply how Mayor Ron Nirenberg sort of navigated this whole crisis. Obviously, last year he fought sort of bitterly to hold on to his seat, escaped, runoff very narrowly. So I spent a lot of my time just sort of like watching how he sort of navigated this. And, he started off the year thinking, this was going to be the year of a big sort of transportation initiative. He remembered this year, he embarked, I guess it was a little bit before this year, he embarked on this push to reallocate the sales tax that goes towards the Edwards Aquifer and linear parks to transit initiative. The pandemic, squabbled all that. They had to reset. And you saw him sort of take a look at this and go, okay, how can we take this crisis and turn it into sort of like a long-term kind of opportunity that sort of like a long-term sort of project to improve the city's economic standing, the people's economic standing. And obviously he pivots to the workforce initiative, which passed overwhelmingly at the November ballot box. But you also see him, sort of attract sort of flack from sort of these, these flanks on council. You see Clayton Perry and Roberto Trevino say that he's worried too much about sort of this long-term kind of approach. You see a little bit from his progressive flank kind of say, this is kind of a business-friendly sort of initiative. Mm-hmm. You saw him draw flack from environmentalists who were upset with the fact that he was, in their eyes, sort of jeopardizing the funding of the Edwards Aquifer protection. You saw him realign himself with sort of business interests. And, you saw him, over the summer, take go out onto the Bexar County Courthouse steps and kind of align himself a little bit with the Black Lives Matter protests and say, hey, look, if we don't deliver on police reform, hold me accountable. And then the city council passes a budget that keeps, police funding pretty much as is. angering a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it is you kind of you see him, sort of gain a little bit more, status and, sort of like authority with the pandemic response itself. You see that in sort of the Fairfax polling, but you also see him kind of behaving in ways that he's done throughout his term, the pandemic notwithstanding, which is kind of like, sometimes, able to please some allies and other times angering them. He's had a very fraught relationship with the business community over his tenure. They were on board with the workforce development. So, I mean, it's kind of a sense of sort of, he doesn't have allies in the same way that I think other mayors might.
Right.
He basically like figures out what he thinks the needs are, and he kind of shifts toward that.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's a really good point, because I think when Julian Castro was mayor, I mean, I think it was fair to say that for that 5-year period, I mean, he had just solid support among progressive voters in the city. I mean, I just think there were very few people who on the political left who were not strong advocates for what he was doing. I think with Nirenberg, you tend to find, more of it's more of a mixed bag. I think there's some disagreement, even among progressives, about his approach, and maybe some frustration. Certainly, they would prefer him to, say, a Greg Brockhouse if that rematch happens in 2021. But yeah, I think that's really true. What's interesting to me too is that Nirenberg was able to have big success with these 3 propositions that were on the November ballot, but it was really, it kind of all fell together there wasn't really necessarily the plan. I mean, he, as you said, he did not plan on workforce development at the beginning of the year. That was something that was a reboot that he made because of the pandemic. He did not plan on pre-K for SA being on the November ballot. He wanted it on the May ballot, so it would be set apart from everything else to increase its chances of success. And then because of the pandemic and election, the timing of the election being changed, it was forced onto the November ballot. And then he didn't really want the public transit proposition. Although he had supported it at the beginning of the year, by the time we got to the summer, it was not something that he really favored. But he was, with pressure coming from the VIA board, he was able to work out a compromise where the public transit funding would wait a few years till after the workforce development expired. So it fell together in a really positive way. He had great success in the election, but there was all kinds of potential for for disaster along the way. It seemed like,
Yeah, and the other thing that I'm thinking about, is you think about sort of that sort of Greg Brockhouse right that exists in San Antonio, and then you look at the map of how the props, how people voted on the props, and this was, I mean, there were 7 precincts, 7 neighborhoods where Prop B got fewer votes than where more people voted against it. So does that like indicate like sort of cross partisan lines appeal? I mean, obviously, it's a nonpartisan seat, but let's be real about this in terms of like liberal conservative crossover, and it seems like Prop B, you can't get there without conservatives on board as well. Kind of given sort of the geographic position of the city. So the thing that we're going to be watching for in the next 6 months is like, okay, does that goodwill that he's achieved during the pandemic carry over into May, or was it all kind of spent on November?
Right. Hey, Brian, you did so many great stories in 2020. I mean, on the public health crisis, on the issue of police reform, on aquifer protection. What stood out to you as far as the stuff that you covered in 2020?
Well, I mean, thanks, Gilbert. I appreciate that. I think the pandemic obviously was front of mind for me. I mean, it dominated my daily life, even away from work. And so
Right.
the stories that I did on that just felt more urgent. Of course, police reform was also up there. But I think probably the stories that stood out for me the most as I look back on the year were sort of lifting the curtain on Metro Health. And Josh, you helped me out with one of these.
That was a big story.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to preface this by saying that, I wrote some critical articles about Metro Health this past year, but obviously the work they do is extremely difficult. And this was in many ways an impossible situation for local health officials across the country. These folks on the local level, they work tirelessly to protect everyone's health. But that being said, there was some dysfunction that came up over the year. And I think that we really realized this for the first time when we saw in June that first surge really hit San Antonio.
Right.
Just this sort of alarm that spread throughout Metro Health that there simply weren't enough contact tracers to handle the number of cases. And so at that point in June, there were only 25 investigators working.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, these are people who call folks who test positive, collect their, determine their close contacts, and then try to reach out to the contacts to warn them to isolate and get tested. A critical response in any pandemic. In June, there were only 25, despite the fact that a Metro Health working group had they had recommended 175 investigators, and so they're just they weren't. Metro Health wasn't quite on the ball, and they weren't quite following that recommendation to ramp up case investigators, and it kind of caught them flat-footed. And then I think so Josh and I actually wrote a story together where we got our hands on thousands of emails, kind of documenting and chronicling this alarm and how they dealt with it. They started offering people overtime to come in from other sections of Metro Health. People who were working in other like immunizations and so forth, to come and work as case investigators to try to get a handle on the surge. And then I think the other one that really stood out for me was this. It was another situation where Metro Health didn't seem to be quite on the ball with antigen tests. Yeah, these are the rapid tests that test for proteins in your nose and throat, and they can be you can get the results within minutes. Metro Health was not counting or investigating positive antigen tests for folks who tested positive on those tests but didn't have any symptoms. And so I wrote a series of stories on that, and the upshot eventually was that they changed the policy to actually count and trace those cases, but it took a while.
And as the pandemic played out, we also had a Metro Health director who hadn't really been here very long, who ended up leaving, and that was. Based on the reporting that you and Josh did, this was there was some real conflict happening within the department, right?
Yeah. I wrote a profile of Dawn Emmerich actually I think it was in May, and her story was interesting because she was hired shortly before the pandemic began and started shortly after everything, everything hit the fan. Yeah. And so it was just, she was sort of thrown into this pressure cooker situation, and I shadowed her for a day. And turns out she was having a very bitter conflict with assistant city manager Colleen Bridger. Mm-hmm. They did not get along. They didn't agree on a lot of things. Emmerich resigned eventually, she resigned actually right as cases were surging. And it was kind of a jarring situation for a lot of people to see the Metro Health Director resign at that time. And then and we had Bridger step in, and she had some conflicts herself with some epidemiologists and some folks in the community who were recommending things in these working groups, such as what I just said about testing folks who test positive, counting and tracing folks who test positive on antigen tests, but who don't have symptoms.
And it's a huge story because it really seems to me, I mean, when the story of the U.S., of the national response to the pandemic is written, the way the country as a whole, I think, failed to kind of get its hands around the contact tracing part of this. I mean, I think there was probably a period when it would have been possible, and before the case numbers started really exploding, and I don't know how successful it could have been, but it feels like I'm sure there's some communities where this was successful, but it feels like that was a big failure in the United States, the ability to handle contact tracing and to be able to slow the spread of this.
Yeah, and I mean, part of the problem was that a lot of people weren't even responding to the calls, right. And there was no way to really force people to cooperate, or even when they did talk to these people and ask them to isolate and get tested, there was no way to make them do that.
Yeah.
And another thing about the sort of the leadership drama at Metro Health is that, obviously there's been sort of this exodus of not just here, but also, across the country of, leaders of health departments who have quit during the pandemic. And, the thing that strikes me is that, San Antonio for most of the pandemic now has been without sort of permanent leadership, and they've had to sort of, rework and refigure out how they're going to, who's in charge, basically. We, for a lot of that time, Colleen Bridger was basically doing 3 jobs. She was assistant city manager overseeing a bunch of departments, and, one of them being Metro Health, which she was in charge of. And, COVID response being sort of separate from that. There was, and she keeps having to sort of, she had said before the summer surge that she was going to leave the city and become a consultant. She's put that off a number of times now. Mm-hmm. And at one point, there was somebody who was basically going to be the Metro Health Director, Dr. Sandra Guerra. She said that she couldn't do it, basically. And so Colleen Bridger had to step in again. And the city is still on sort of its hunt for a permanent replacement. But yeah, it's, to have, basically an entire pandemic where, most of the time there's no permanent leadership at the top of Metro Health is interesting.
Yep, that's absolutely right. I wanted to talk a little bit about election issues, which is what I tended to focus on the most in 2020, and how the pandemic affected that. And because of concerns about the safety of voting in person, we saw a surge across the country in mail-in voting. And we also had a push locally from County Commissioner Justin Rodriguez to open up the voting process. They created some mega centers within the county, including the AT&T Center, for people to vote. And you started to have some partisan conflict within the state. For example, with Harris County, they wanted to use all their satellite elections offices as places where people could drop off their mail ballots if they wanted to drop them off in person. And Governor Greg Abbott, put the halt on that and said they could only use one office for the entire county. So these kinds of conflicts, it played out during the year. But I think the thing that we probably the big story was that Democrats looked at 2020 in Texas as this is going to be a watershed year. This could be a year when Democrats are able to flip the Texas House, gain some congressional seats, possibly have their presidential candidate Joe Biden carry the state for the first time. Have a Democrat for the first time in 44 years carry the state of Texas, and those things didn't happen, and Democrats were able to do what they hoped and expected to do, which was, really, they had a very successful turnout effort. And if we look at the turnout numbers in recent years, you had Hillary Clinton in 2016, who lost by 9% to Donald Trump, got 3.9 million votes. In 2018, Beto O'Rourke, who came very close to winning a U.S. Senate election, got a little bit more than 4 million votes. So in the 2016 presidential election, we had just under 9 million people voting. This year, we had more than 11.3 million. So, and a lot of that was an increased Democratic turnout. Joe Biden got about 5.26 million votes in Texas this year. So this is about 1/3 more than Hillary Clinton got 4 years ago. The problem for Democrats in Texas and in many parts of the country was that Republicans were able to match that surge in turnout. So while Joe Biden was getting a record for any Democrat in Texas, 5.26 million, Donald Trump was getting about 5.9 million. And this played out a lot. And what happened in the presidential election with Trump losing to Biden was kind of one of the most prominent exception to that. In that case, Republicans were able to really increase their turnout. Trump got 12 million more votes than he got 4 years ago, but Democrats were able to step it up way beyond that. And in Texas and in a lot of the congressional races across the country, that didn't happen. Republicans were able to match or even exceed that Democratic surge. And it really affected a couple of districts that include San Antonio. U.S. District 23, it's been a swing district for a long time. Will Hurd, the Republican, was stepping down. Democrats thought, we've got it this year. And Democratic nominee Gina Ortiz-Jones, because of the pandemic, ran basically a virtual campaign. She did these virtual town halls, did not do a lot of in-person campaigning. Her Republican opponent, Tony Gonzalez, a former Navy cryptologist, went out across the district and campaigned in person very aggressively and won by a comfortable margin. That was, I think, a big upset. And also in U.S. District 21, which includes Austin, parts of the Hill Country and northern San Antonio, Chip Roy, the Republican, was a first-term congressman, was seen as vulnerable in that district and was challenged by a former Fort Worth State Senator, Wendy Davis. And Chip Roy won that one also pretty comfortably. And I think that the hope that Democrats had that they were going to see this a surge that was going to sweep Democrats into office didn't happen, and there was no net gain for Democrats in the Texas House. It will continue to be controlled by Republicans. So I think this is going to be there's going to be a lot of soul searching among Democrats, but I think it's important that when they look at the story, the failure was not a failure among Democrats to turn out the votes, which has been a problem in the past. They've always said, we've got the votes here in Texas, we're just not getting people to vote. We're not a Republican state, as Beto O'Rourke says, we're a non-voting state. Democrats came out this year, but Republicans were able to match or exceed them where it mattered. And I think that that's going to make Democrats think a little bit about when the turnout numbers go up, it's not necessarily always going to benefit Democrats, and that Republicans, at least for now, seem to have within the state the numbers to continue continue controlling the state. At the certainly at the legislative level and in the statewide races. So I think it's been a big disappointment for Democrats, and I think that's something that they're going to have to evaluate and figure out what they do about that going forward.
Yeah, so something that I noticed, and I wrote about this a week or so ago. You look at Biden's performance in Bexar County, and you see him making inroads in a lot of places that are traditionally conservative.
Right.
He does what, like, he wins Alamo Heights by 8 percentage points. Hillary Clinton won by like 4 votes last time. He did better than Trump in like Steve Allison's district. He does better than Trump in precinct 3, which is pretty conservative or reliably conservative. He does well in the he does better than Trump in the parts of Bexar County that include Texas 21st and Texas 23rd congressional districts. He outperforms Trump in all of these conservative areas. But then you see these neighborhoods, these votes flip back for Steve Allison, Trish DeBerry, Chip Roy, Tony Gonzalez. What you're seeing is that Biden was able to sway a bunch of a couple thousand Trump voters or Republicans who were disaffected with Trump, I should say. Those are two different things. But the thing is that those folks weren't looking to punish people down ballot for that. Right. So if you're Steve Allison, you benefit from turning out Trump's base. That core Republican base, who's going to vote Republican straight ticket, and he also benefits, and I'm using Steve Allison here, but he also benefits from the sort of the Biden Republicans who Republicans who were sick of Trump, but are still Republicans.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the encouraging thing for Republicans in Texas and in other parts of the country, in that Trump's coattails were not very strong, and there was a fear among Republicans that he had these toxic coattails that were going to just bring down a lot of Republicans. In the close to 2 months since Election Day, Trump has vented about his loss and said it was the result of fraud, and among other things, he has expressed anger at fellow Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who have not Mitch McConnell has now declared Joe Biden to be president-elect. And so Trump has attacked some of these people and said, well, I helped get him reelected. I saved them. And that's his perception. But I think the reality is probably that, they all, a lot of these Republicans across the country outperformed Trump, and they were able to win because, as you said, Josh, there were conservatives who said, I'm not happy with Trump. I've had enough of him. But down ballot, I'm going to vote for the Republicans. So he believes that he saved them, but I think the reality was that in many cases they were able to survive, his toxicity in some of these places. Which I think some Republicans would look at that and think that it would be encouraging for a post-Trump Republican future, that they would be able to say enough Republican or conservative voters were willing to vote down ballot for Republicans despite their issues with Trump. So that's going to be the thing to see. And I think, again, as I said, there are things happening, as you pointed out, in Texas. I mean, certainly the urban areas of the state have become solidly blue. Bexar County, I've just seen over the past 10 years how it went from a leaning blue to a really very solidly blue county. And I think Biden won like 9 out of 10 San Antonio city council districts. So we've seen this shift happening over the past few years. There is something happening in the state, but at least for now, Republicans have been able to match that with increased turnout in their strong areas. So that's going to be the issue going forward to see what happens with the state. I think we're going to wrap things up there, and I want to thank you all for listening to us this year, and we hope you all have a happy new year, wishing that everyone has a better and safer 2021 than we had in 2020, and thank you all for listening. Take care, everybody.